Hey everyone, welcome to part 2 of the homemade mini crossbow series. Today we're going to start by making the crossbow's handle and trigger. I created these designs through trial and error and found them to work the best. They're free to download and print out, so you guys won't have to draw the designs yourselves. Click this link to get the templates. Once you've got a copy, cut out the trigger at the outside of the line so that there's still a border when you're done. Let's also cut out a handle template. I recommend the one on the right because it works for longer draw lengths on the crossbow and shorter lengths as well. However, if you prefer a smooth handle that doesn't stick past the end of the crossbow, you can use the left one. Alright, what we want to do with our trigger template now is trace it onto a piece of our 1/8 inch plywood. An ultrafine permanent marker works great for this. For the handle, it's best to use thicker plywood because it's made of 2 layers. We want a 1/4 inch plank of plywood this time, which is twice as wide as the other one. Trace the handle template onto the 1/4 inch plank twice. If you don't want to buy another thicker piece of plywood, you could use 4 layers of the 1/8 inch plank. Simply glue 2 pairs of 2 layers together before you cut them out. Once all your parts are traced, let's head outside and cut them out. I recommend using a scroll saw, which is what I'm using right here. A small blade works better for the thinner wood, while a slightly thicker blade works well for the thicker plank. You'll probably get pieces of scrap wood like this while cutting out the handles. Hold on to them as they'll be used in a future step. When you've cut everything out, check for major errors that would compromise the strength or design of each piece. If they aren't cut exactly on the lines but they look pretty good, it's not a big deal. We'll be able to refine them later on. By now, our pair of cubes should definitely be dry enough to work with. What we need to do with them is drill a hole basically in the middle of the plywood with a 1/16 inch drill bit. I'm not sure how drill bits are made and labeled for other countries, but this drill bit is about 1.6 millimeters in diameter. We need to make sure that the hole we drilled has a decent depth. Marking the length with my finger, I can see that mine needs to be drilled a little bit more. We're looking for a depth of about 6 millimeters, preferably without drilling through to the other side. Now we need some number 216 1/2 inch screw eyes. Using a pair or 2 of needle nose pliers, bend the hook outwards and cut a small length off with wire cutters. Now bend it back into a more open circle. With our hook ready to go, screw it into the hole we just drilled in the pair of cubes. If you hear any cracking sound, stop immediately, take it out, and drill the hole a little wider. This is a sign that the wood is splitting, which we really don't want to happen. Once we've screwed in the hook as far as the threads go, we're ready to glue it onto the top crossbow piece. Put some glue on the bottom side, which is the side with the gap between the cubes. Now place it on the front end of the crossbow with the screw eye facing inward. Your top crossbow piece should now look like this. For this part, we'll need another 4 wooden cubes. Start by gluing one directly on top of both of the back cubes, and then glue one on each front cube. Check them before they dry to make sure they aren't leaning into each other. Now let's get out our rotary tool with a grinding wheel. In this step, we'll be creating the groove which holds a bowstring. Make the groove right in the space between the trigger slot and the track. Grind it deeper in the center of the crossbow, but shallow towards the edges. If you start to see your colored popsicle stick, try not to grind any further. The key here is to make sure the groove is completely perpendicular to the track and it's cut to an even depth. Now that we've got that, let's go ahead and remove any cardboard or wood left on the surface between the groove and the track. Do not grind the track itself, only the elevated material on top of it. The surface of the track should now be smooth and clear of obstacles. With that done, let's use a hobby file to extend the rectangular trigger slot all the way to the beginning of the track. This 4-sided square file works well for tight corners and keeping a rectangular shape. We'll refine the slot when we test it with the trigger, but this is generally what the piece should look like when you're done filing. Alright, we're finally going to start working on the side pieces of the crossbow. Grab your trigger and make a dot above the center of the circular shape. Now rotate the crossbow piece so that you can see the dot and insert the top left part of the trigger through the slot. Place your thumb underneath the right part to keep it in place while swinging the trigger in and out. We want to position the trigger so that it's the farthest possible distance from the slot while still being able to pass through. To do this, rotate your trigger in and out while positioning it more and more to the right. When you found the point where the trigger goes through while still giving a little bit of resistance, hold it in that position. Make a dot on the crossbow piece so that it lines up with the dot on the trigger. Now remove the trigger and grab one of the side pieces, which are the pairs of popsicle sticks with no gap between them. Line it up so that the ends of the popsicle sticks match up with the ends on the top piece. Make a dot on the side piece in line with the dot we just made. Using the trigger to determine how high the dot should go, we can see that it should be placed a bit underneath the middle. Let's label this side piece for convenience. The trigger slot is at the back of the crossbow, so this side is the right side. Next, we need to draw the dot on the left piece like we did for the right piece. It's helpful to draw another dot on the top piece on the other side, making it easier to line up accurately. Go ahead and draw a new dot at the same height as a dot on the right side. Let's do a quick check to make sure everything lines up correctly. Notice that the cubes are taller than the side pieces. This is a problem because a crossbow can only be as thick as the width of the sides. To solve this, use your marker to draw lines on the cubes where the side ends. Now we actually need to draw another line on each cube that's lower than the first by about the width of a popsicle stick. I forgot I needed to do this when I was filming the video, so in this clip I had already grinded down the cubes to the first line. But you should have two lines on the outer side of each cube. As you see here, the second line should be at about the midpoint of each one. Now let's get our Dremel and a coarse sanding band attachment. Sand each cube down to the bottom line, making sure to keep the surface nice and flat. It's easy to accidentally make them round by keeping the bit in one spot for too long, so move the tool back and forth. A helpful tip for keeping the surface flat is to rotate the crossbow piece to change the direction that it's being sanded. There should be little or no red marker remaining when you finish sanding. Keep in mind that your cubes should be a little shorter since I forgot to draw that second line and didn't sand it down enough. Once we've finished sanding the tops of the cubes, we can now trim down any sides that stick out over the edge of the popsicle sticks. Ideally, none should be sticking out, but it's not easy to make the crossbow perfectly. If your cubes are even with the edge of the popsicle sticks, you're good to go. Since our Dremel and sanding belt piece are already out, this is a good opportunity to sand our plywood shapes we cut out earlier. We can use it to remove jagged edges and inconsistencies with both the handle pieces and the trigger. The handle pieces look much better now, and they'll feel better when holding the crossbow later. I also fixed my trigger, so that's good to go as well. Now let's get an electric drill and a 5/64 inch drill bit. We'll need to drill a hole completely through the dot on the trigger. For the side pieces, we also want to drill a hole on the dot, but not all the way through. We want a hole that's just shy of reaching the cardboard surface. This depth is about 2 mm. Before we move on, let's test the holes we drilled with a 2 mm steel rod with rounded ends. You should be able to fit the rod completely through the trigger with some resistance, and it should fit into the holes in the side pieces nicely. These steel rods are also needed for the mini crossbow prod project, which I previously showed how to make. They can be found in longer pieces in bulk online, or in pre-cut rounded pieces by clicking this annotation. Now assemble the pieces as shown and put them next to the top crossbow piece. As you can see, my steel rod is too long and the sides won't fit against the top part. I marked it a little bit past the edge of the top piece. It turned out to be 2.4 centimeters, which is about how long you should make yours. However, it really depends on the craft sticks you used and how you spaced them out. An easy way to determine the proper length for your steel rod is to measure the bottom crossbow piece, which we haven't worked on yet. Add 3 mm to the measurement, and this will effectively give the perfect length. Once you've marked the correct length for the steel, go ahead and trim it with your rotary tool and grinding wheel. Grinding metal generates a lot of heat, and the rod can burn you if you're not careful. You'll need to pause in between grinds to keep the temperature down. Or if you're impatient like me, you can use an insulating surface to grip the piece as you cut it. After you finish cutting it, give it some time to cool down. You can test the heat by touching it for very short periods of time. When it's cool enough, round the edges to make it easier to work with. Now when we put the frame together, it should have a nice fit and the ends of the steel rod shouldn't be visible. That's looking good, so let's finally start working on the bottom piece of the crossbow. What we need to do with the bottom piece is create a slot that allows the trigger to move back and forth but not sideways. With the frame correctly assembled, tilt the trigger toward the front of the crossbow to the angle shown here. The rectangular nub should be underneath all layers of the top crossbow piece. Now we can estimate the general position of the trigger at the point where it rises above the sides of the crossbow. Make a dash at this position on the bottom piece. Now tilt the trigger into the trigger slot and again mentally trace this position back to the bottom piece to mark it. Here's how my dashes measure up, but keep in mind it'll vary depending on where you made the trigger slot on the top piece. Also, these measurements are not permanent. If needed, the bottom trigger slot can always be expanded later on. Alright, let's go ahead and connect the dashes by drawing a rectangle. We want this rectangle to be symmetrical around the gap between the craft sticks. Try to make it about as wide as the thickness of your trigger. Our next task is to cut out the rectangle. A Dremel can get the job done nicely. Keep checking to see if your trigger can fit as you grind the rectangle. If there's too much resistance, grind it a little more until it doesn't have room to wiggle side to side, but you can easily move it back and forth. Once that's done, put the top and bottom pieces together with the trigger inserted through the slot on the bottom. Line up the trigger with the dot on the top piece and lean the trigger forward. Make a line on the trigger where it meets the bottom piece, and then take the frame apart again. Now we need to drill another hole in the trigger, so grab your drill and a 1/16 inch drill bit. The hole has to be drilled as far above the line as possible, but below the circular part of the trigger. It needs to be drilled at a relatively horizontal angle, as shown here. This part is kind of hard and dangerous, so adult help is recommended. A helpful tip is to start the hole by drilling at a steeper angle and then drill the rest of the way at the correct one. When finished, the hole should have a depth of about 1/4 inch. Let's grab another screw eye and make sure there's a small opening in the loop. Screw it into the trigger until the threads are no longer visible and we're ready to start putting the crossbow frame together. This makes a good break point for the project. Thanks for watching, I'll see you guys in part 3.